Right, well, thank you everyone for coming and joining us today, and for those live on Zoom, we really appreciate it. And thank you to the panelists. It's good to see so many familiar faces in this audience. I'm Erin Wilson. I lead our new program on extremism for Human Rights First, and I've had the pleasure of getting to know the panelists up here in previous roles, working for both the federal and state government, which is part of why I thought today's discussion would be so important. Because so often in this space, we talk about what the federal government is doing or should be doing, or occasionally we talk about what practitioners are doing. But often in these discussions, we leave out the important role of state and local government officials, and that is, and I'll get to this in a minute, the very battleground for this space in many ways. So I appreciate you all being here. And before I turn to my panelists to introduce themselves, I want to take a moment to provide framing, a broader context for this discussion. And we view this, we know hate is on the rise in our country, and I could go through the various different statistics and markers for that. But we know it's on the rise, and we see at Human Rights First the primary threat being this larger anti-democratic far-right extremist movement. And the individuals that subscribe to this movement in one capacity or another, they're individuals, they're groups, they're mainstream networks, and they believe a range of things, including militia extremism, nativist extremism, extremist conspiracy theories such as QAnon. Probably the most predominant threat is that by white supremacy. And they also use a variety of tactics. These tactics can be physically terrorizing a community to trying to install and shape state and local policies and programs steeped in xenophobia, racism, bigotry, you name it. So in addition, and most notably probably for today's discussion, is that we know that for decades, this broader extremist movement has tried to infiltrate and influence state and local policies. Because, of course, in our federated system, it is state and local policies that often have the most impact on our daily lives. And a few examples of this. We see this, for instance, in border states when elected officials falsely and illegally proclaim a migrant invasion. And they use language in part to try and leverage our National Guard, but they're using language that white supremacists themselves have used to inspire or justify the attacks we saw in Pittsburgh and Buffalo, and I could go on. We also see this tactics when school boards reject the anti-racist civil rights movement ideology and protest the critical race theory. We see examples of this in state efforts to roll back the rights for the LGBTQ plus community. We see this in efforts to roll back a woman's right to bodily autonomy. So in these various different tactics, we see it again and again at the state and local level. And we must also recognize in this discussion that the legacy of hate in our country, and notably in our policies and institutions through systemic and racial bias, lends legitimacy to this movement's efforts to further entrench these policies of xenophobia, racism, bigotry, misogyny, you name it. So repairing the harm that this, what I call legacy hate, has caused and supporting targeted communities is critical if we're going to figure out a way to actually address the hate that we're seeing today. And addressing hate and extremism requires an approach that doesn't just focus on these violent tactics, right? It also looks at how we can affect change with the cultural and institutional tactics that this broader movement is trying to mainstream and employ. And it means that we have to challenge the hate tolerance that we already have in our country, right? That we see through these policies and institutions and our public narratives. And that is exactly why strong leadership at the state and local level is so imperative if we are going to ever be able to address this problem and protect our communities, protect our democracy, and reverse the rising threat. So our panelists today are very much on the front lines of this threat, and I really appreciate you all being here because your work is more important now than ever before. So with that framing, I'll turn it to you now to please introduce yourselves. And with the first question, it'll be multi-part, so feel free to choose whichever part is most relevant to you. And Jumana, we'll start with you and go down the line. I should also add for our audience, I'm not going to give our panelists have spent decades doing this work. It had many different roles. They've really committed their lives to addressing hate and furthering social justice. And that's why I feel so lucky to be able to have this conversation with you today. And their bios are all on the Summit webpage and in the books that some of you might have in front of you. And we also have a geographically diverse panel. We have California, Rhode Island, Colorado, and Washington State represented, which is really nice for today. So for your first question, after introducing yourself, can you tell us a little bit about the state of hate in the city or state that you represent? Be that hate crimes, who's being targeted, other types of hate-motivated bias that is a rise or a particular concern in your area, and the specific issues with hate that you're dealing with. So Jumana, I'll turn it to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin.
Sure.
And it's just wonderful to be here. Great to be with this panel right here and got an opportunity to know some of my fellow panelists and the work that we are doing. I am with the City of Los Angeles with the Civil, Human Rights, and Equity Department. We're fairly a new department, and I'll share a little bit more about our department. We started 2 years ago. The department was launched by Mayor Eric Garcetti, and with the leadership of Capri Maddox, who was appointed by the mayor to lead the department. So we're fairly new, but I have been in this space and working in this space for many years. As Erin had shared, we've worked together in various capacities in the space of addressing hate and extremism and really looking at preventions outside of the law enforcement space. But to answer your question around the state of hate and where we are, in Los Angeles in 2021, we had 615 hate crimes reported. And unfortunately, we are on track to exceed that record number. That was a record number that we set in 2021 as the highest recorded hate crimes in the country, and that was by the Center on Hate and Extremism. And we are on track to exceed that. So I just want to let that kind of settle in for a minute. And this is for a big city like LA. We're 4 million people in the city of LA. When we look at the numbers and the reporting, we also know that there is gaps in the reporting. LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department, they are one of very few law enforcement agencies that will take reporting of both hate crimes and hate incidents. And so when we look at our numbers and when we look at what is being reported through LAPD, we also look at the gaps in what we receive from community-based organizations who are also taking on hate reporting. So now I'll give you an example of what these gaps look like. The Stop AAPI Hate reported 245 between March and October of 2020, whereas the numbers that were reported, officially reported to LAPD, that was 359 documented. ADL, 791. Most of it is related to online white supremacy, neo-Nazi activities. So you could see the gaps of what is being officially reported through the law enforcement reporting mechanisms versus what gets reported to nonprofit organizations. But not only are we looking at these gaps in terms of reporting, we're also looking at who is being targeted, right? And when we start to look at the data and the numbers, we certainly see the African American community, the Black community being targeted. During the pandemic, we saw a tremendous increase in targeting AAPI communities, and unfortunately, we're continuing to see that trend. LGBTQ community is another really big target of hate, and then we're also seeing it with immigrant communities and immigrant populations who are also being targeted. So we're definitely seeing those trends at play, and they're very alarming to see that we are on the rise, and those trends continue to show that we are on track to exceed prior record numbers. I can't really say why that is on some level, and a part of me wants to think like, okay, we are making progress in reporting and more people are reporting, so maybe that's a good indicator. But unfortunately, looking at where we are as a society and how polarized we are, not just as a city, but as a country, and even globally, these trends are very telling of that polarization. I know we'll talk a little bit more about that, and I do want to talk about the element of trust when it comes to reporting. But I also would love to hear from my fellow panelists on that as well.
Thank you, Jumana. And again, it's great to be here too with such a great group of panelists who we've had a lot of fun getting to know each other here at the summit, and so it's just great to be a part of it. With regard to, well, I guess who I am first. My name is Keith Hoffman. I'm the chief of the Civil and Community Rights Unit and the Civil Rights Advocate in the Rhode Island Attorney General's Office. In that role, I focus on hate crime prosecution, police misconduct reviews, along with kind of more civil rights issues, education, civil rights, housing discrimination, lead poisoning prevention. So we're a pretty small office, and I wear a lot of hats. But I think that there's real intersection among a lot of this work. These are social justice issues, these are racial justice issues, these are economic justice issues that, as Erin so eloquently put it in the beginning, can contribute to this rising tide of hate that we're all experiencing in our communities. In Rhode Island, there's annual variation in reporting, and when I talk about reporting in the state of Rhode Island, I'm talking about our UCR, Uniform Crime Reporting data. We have a state law that requires police departments to report hate crimes. If anyone out there does not have a law like that on the books, I think it's a really important measure for increasing reporting. But we found when we started looking at this work, when our Attorney General Nerona came in about 4 years ago, that it was pretty spotty in terms of how departments were doing their reporting. And so we've really worked hard to train police departments, and we'll talk about, I think, some of those ways to investigate and report and refer, where appropriate, cases to us. So for us, it is difficult to kind of tease out, well, how much of the increase that we're seeing in Rhode Island is caused by doing a better job reporting, as Jumana was saying, and how much of it is caused by increasing hate crimes, which we also know is happening. In Rhode Island, again, there's this annual variation, so I think it's helpful just to group it by years. If you look at between 2012 and 2016 and 2017 to 2021, those two periods, hate crimes were significantly up in terms of reporting, between 30 to 50%, depending on which group you're looking at. In Rhode Island, annually, almost every year, the group that's targeted most are people in the LGBTQIA plus community, followed by our Black community, and then our Jewish community. We have seen a rise, although the numbers are very small, among folks in our AAPI community, but we've prosecuted cases involving those hate crimes, and very, very scary, and not things that we had seen before really the pandemic and the awful language that fueled the rise in hate against that community. So we, I think, are facing those kind of similar challenges where it's a matter of focusing on increasing reporting, and we are seeing kind of the fruits of that, including referrals to our office, but it is, as I said, difficult to tease out whether there has been truly, well, how much of the increase is fueled by the increase in reporting and how much is fueled by the rise in hate. With that, I guess I'll pass it on.
Thanks, Keith. Good afternoon. My name is Derek Okubo. I'm the executive director for the Agency for Human Rights and Community Partnerships. It's a mouthful. With the city and county of Denver, Colorado. Our agency has an interesting history. This year we are 75 years old. We were started by a young progressive mayor who in 1947 defeated the incumbent, Ben Stapleton, who had an infamous relationship with the KKK. And so when Mayor Newton came in, one of the first things he did was to form a commission on human relations, which studied the state of race relations in Denver at that time. It was fascinating to read the report. At that time, there had been an influx of Japanese Americans who were released from the camps, my family among them, who relocated to Denver. And then also an influx of Mexican immigrants at that time. We had a long, historic African-American and Jewish community there. So when you looked at the report, it really talked a lot about the systemic racism that was in place at that time. And when I read it for the first time, it just really graphically explained, when you look at the health, wealth, education gaps that exist today, you see it, the reasons why, when you read these reports as far as the intentional and deliberate discrimination that was in place. Currently, we have 8 offices in our agency, and also the 10 advisory commissions that advise the Mayor Hancock and myself as far as issues going on in the community and strategies to address them. They are very key as far as informing us as far as what is going on in the community. As far as our state of hate crimes, in Denver right now, again, reporting is an issue. And I think even in talking with Keith right before this, even how we categorize, there's some issues there that I'm going to learn from Keith and bring back to Denver as far as how we report and how we categorize. But right now, when I was talking with our bias-motivated crime unit, they were informing that right now, earlier today, they were investigating places of worship were being targeted as far as especially our Jewish synagogues. There was an incident last week as far as some harassment and some flyering that was taking place. As far as our hate crimes, 55% of them are race-based, with African Americans being the top target of the hate crimes at this time. 27% are targeted toward our LGBTQ plus community. And then the other 17 or 18% are more religious-based, with the larger amount being toward our Jewish community, with some targeted toward our Muslim community as well. The number of hate crimes that we have, like I said, I think reporting is a huge issue. Trust in something happening. I know that for myself, I have heard from our AAPI community of incidences that have happened, and I've asked them, did you report that? And then by far, probably 90% of them said no, that they did not report. They didn't want to deal with the issue. They wanted it to go away. They were unsure what would happen, those types of reasons. So again, I hear you, Keith. Working on the reporting is something that's really important, and something that we got to work on. And I'd be interested, talking to you as far as LA, what you might be doing too, as far as to increase that. So I'll turn it over to my colleague to the right.
Thank you, Derek. Imagine being excited about your new job. You're relieved that you don't have to worry about skyrocketing rent because your employer has provided your housing that you share with your roommate. You're sleeping peacefully, and one night you'll wake up suddenly and see your roommate standing over you, hurling racial epithets, homophobic slurs, and threatening to strangle you. Telling you you don't belong in this country. Imagine taking your family for a vacation. It was a beautiful summer. You want to sightsee. You pick up a bicycle. You pedal across the bridges of Portland taking in the scenery when you're accosted by a racist, challenging you about your identity, telling you you don't belong in this country, you've taken my stuff. All the while he's punching you in the head some 50 times, hurling anti-Asian slurs at you, and before he turns his violence towards your 5-year-old daughter, who has witnessed it all. The state of hate in Oregon is on the rise. We have had assaults, we have had vandalism, we have had harassment, we've had anti-government extremists shutting down roadways, putting up illegal roadblocks. We've had them storm our capital in Salem, defiling our beautiful state capital. From menacing behavior, microaggressions to murder, Oregon has seen it all. My name is Faye Stetz-Waters, and I'm the Director of Civil Rights and Social Justice at the Oregon Department of Justice, where we are pushing back against this type of behavior, this type of hate, with a bias response hotline. This hotline is victim-centered, focuses on the victim. It's answered by trained professionals who are trained in trauma-informed practices and procedures. And they are there to help victims of hate and bias in the aftermath of those things. And we work closely with community-based organizations who deliver and specialize in culturally specific services. And so we also collect data about these incidents. We had no data about the extent of this problem. We collect data and we share this data with the public and with our leaders to increase awareness of this problem, to help shift this tide away from where we are. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you all for sharing. As you can see, we all have slightly different experiences with hate in our location, but it's definitely very problematic, and there's some different approaches and ways we can go about addressing it. And I'll stick with the theme of what I call acute hate and hate crimes. And Faye, actually, I'll go right back to you, and then Jumana and Keith. But perhaps maybe in 60 seconds, can you tell us what your office is doing, what your city or state is doing to combat hate crimes, and how you think it's going so far?
We've got a statewide bias response hotline. We lifted up the hotline in 2020, and what a show. It was just in time to be able to capture all of the data and all of the things that were happening. The first year, we had 1,100 reports of hate and bias in our state. The second year increased by 53%, 1,683 we had. And we are on target to exceed that number this year. We're already about 1,800 reports. We are providing services to the victim, which is was a gap in the law, really. And we need to tend to the people who are experiencing hate and bias. We think we're doing a good job on that point, and we want to share those efforts with the world.
Thank you.
So I think, as we've heard from everyone on this panel, reporting and gaps in reporting are really a big issue, right? And we talked a little bit about trust. And one of the things when we looked at this challenge of reporting, we really looked at, again, trust. Vast majority of those who are impacted by hate are afraid to call law enforcement, especially when we've all talked about the groups who are impacted, right? We talked about LGBTQ immigrant communities. There's a tremendous fear of contacting law enforcement. And I think similarly for some of the religious communities, Jewish communities who've been greatly targeted, Muslim communities, the Black African American communities. I mean, there's serious lack of trust that go far deep into the historical relationships. And so, yes, we do take reporting through our law enforcement and LAPD, but one of the things we wanted to look at is what is it that our communities know right away? And we did sort of think about this idea of a hotline. But in the city of LA, we have what's called a 311 line. And that is something that everyone in the city knows to call. They call it for trash pickup, they call it for all kinds of city services, and everybody knows what 311 is. So for us, it was the idea of how do we then expand reporting outside of law enforcement, right? Because if those who are impacted by hate are afraid of calling law enforcement, then there needs to be an alternative. So what we did is we expanded our reporting through our 311 line system. In addition to expanding that reporting, we've essentially looked at, so we worked closely with our IT department, our 311, and LAPD, and we looked at what are the reporting fields? How are reporting fields through law enforcement? And what we did is we mimicked these reporting fields. But aside from that, we've also looked at protocols. There is an aspect of risk mitigation as well when it comes to reporting. Because the last thing you want is for someone to call either as a witness who's witnessing a hate crime or somebody who's impacted by hate, and there is an immediate threat to public safety. So in thinking about expanding reporting, we also thought about what sorts of protocols do we need to put in terms of risk management and risk mitigation. And so what we've done is we've also trained our 311 operators, not only in terms of asking the types of questions to recognize, are you in immediate danger? Is the perpetrator in the vicinity? So there are these types of questions that go almost instantly. And whether or not the individual who's reporting is comfortable with contacting law enforcement. Now, of course, if this is an immediate threat of violence and threat of harm, that's why we have law enforcement, right? Their lane is interdiction. Their lane is response. But when we look at hate and the impact of hate, that impact is so traumatic, not just for the victim, but it is very traumatic for the collective, for the community. And I really love, Faye, that you talked about trauma-informed, because that has to be at the center of everything we do. Trauma-informed, victim-centered, and that's what we also did with our 311, is we've provided that level of training so that as they are taking on this reporting, they're able to, address the trauma that the individual who's reporting. The other thing we've done is reporting can be anonymous. But on the back end, when we talk about data and when we look at data sets and there are differences in terms of what we see of what gets reported, one of the things when we look at hate data, it's usually a year or so old, right? Mm-hmm. Which is helpful in understanding the historical trends. But for those of us, and I know all of us on this panel, we're sort of in the thick of it. It's great to be able to look at something from a year ago, but we want to know what's happening now. So part of what that allowed us to do is it allowed us to almost look at the data on the back end where we could look at near real-time data as things are being reported. So when we think about policy and when we think about programming and initiative, our hope is that as we work towards data that's near real-time, that will better inform our leadership and it will better inform our response. And so these are some of the things that that we've are attempting to continue to kind of expand and grow. The other thing I really want to hone in on is messaging. Messaging is critical, right? How do we put out? Because if we just put out, here is a number, report hate. And if we're putting out to communities who are even afraid to call and report hate, and let's be honest in this conversation, a lot of this is also, it has to be culturally informed, right? Because there is an aspect of face saving. There is a cultural aspect where people, not so much that they don't trust in wanting to report, there is a face saving element that makes people afraid of reporting. So messaging is critical. And one of the things we did in LA is we launched the LA for All campaign. And the whole point of the LA for All campaign is that we're putting out a positive messaging that elevates and promotes our core value of an inclusive city. But when you say LA for All, we're all a part of something, right? We stand for something rather than standing against. And so through that messaging, we've also promoted hate reporting, and we've also promoted connection with resources. We work with other agencies like 211. We also work with some of our community-based organizations because we know that they're getting the most sort of connection and the most reporting. And so we want to cultivate those relationships through messaging, but also through expanding access to reporting.
Thank you, Jumana. Keith?
Yeah, so I'll try to just cover it all really quick because I know you want to get to some other questions I think that we prepped, but I'll try to cover what we've done. This new Attorney General Rona, took office in 2019, and early 2019. There had not been a hate crime prosecution in Rhode Island in the years before that, although we knew that hate crimes were happening. We'd spoken with people who had been hate crime victims. The cases just weren't being prosecuted as such, weren't necessarily being reported as such. And so we knew we had an issue, and the question was, how are we going to bring these cases to a place where they can be prosecuted and also where they can be reported as hate crimes? And so we took a number of steps. The first was naming in each police department hate crimes and civil rights liaison officer. So this is an officer who is responsible in their community for hate crimes and civil rights issues. In Rhode Island, we were really fortunate. Our law enforcement partners were all very much on board with this. And every police department, including campus police departments, including like the airport police department, has named a hate crime and civil rights liaison officer. Once you have the liaison officer, you can roll out policies through them. And so you can issue guidances and policies that the departments can adopt. This was, I was telling Derek before about one policy that's about hate crime reporting. It's very, very kind of complicated. You can say reporting, but what should count, right, is actually a kind of a complicated question. And so we have a document that hopefully makes it pretty straightforward for our departments when they're deciding whether or not to report a hate crime as a hate crime. They can also contact us and we can provide advice. Once the cases are kind of with the officers and are reported as hate crimes, then they can be referred to us for more investigation and prosecution. We've had, at this point, over 60 cases referred to us by departments. We've prosecuted about 10 of them as hate crimes. That's not an enormous number, but it's a very significant increase from the past, and the process is, I think, working pretty well at this point. But on the community piece, I really think that this is important. We all know that not everybody is comfortable going to police departments, and just naming a hate crime and civil rights liaison officer actually does help a little bit with some folks in the community who are now like, okay, this is the person that I can talk to that's going to have some training in how to handle these issues. But it doesn't help everybody. And so we've partnered with a number of different community organizations. There's a hotline in Rhode Island called the Helpline. We've trained up all the Helpline volunteers on how to take in calls related to hate crimes. Usually it's a DV reporting line, but now it's a DV and hate crime reporting line. We have a number of folks who are in different communities who've actually brought victims to us, and they can kind of liaise with us, sit in on the initial interview if the victim would like, and that has happened before in some of our cases. That's also been a great tool that we're looking to expand upon. So I'm probably leaving some stuff out, but I do think that for us, that hate crime liaison program, which I should say, you really have to, if you're going to implement that, you do have to keep a lot of touches on it. You can't just allow it to be like, oh, we announced the program and then you never contact the liaisons again. So you actually might want to try to roll out the policies and guidances periodically, just to have a lot of touches, and then train them, right? So ideally annual training. So our first large in-person annual training was a hate crime summit that Cynthia Dietl, who's in the audience today, helped us to put together last December. That was we think a big success. Almost every police department in the state was trained at that on hate crimes, of course, but also more generally on discrimination and bigotry and its existence in our communities.
Thank you so much. I wish that all states were as progressive and forward-leading and proactive on this as your states are. Shifting gears a little, I want to talk about systemic hate and bias and discrimination. And in probably, again, 60 seconds or less, Derek and then Keith, could you talk to what your city-states are doing to both prevent that and respond to that?
As far as the systemic, situations.
And broader discrimination.
Yeah, one of the things that is so important is, and I'm going to do this in 60 seconds, okay?
Just give them a teaser.
Yeah. Well, the partnerships with the community is absolutely essential. As far as our relationships with our nonprofits, our churches, our synagogues, our mosques, our temples, and with that relationship, we get the information in, we get the information out. They actually oftentimes will take the lead in certain situations where we're the partner, but they're the lead. As far as the convening, they're, in all honesty, they're more trusted than government. They're embedded in the community and they do great work, and so their partnership, it just really absolutely makes sense. And I can't say how much those relationships have been so impactful as far as us to be able to get things done and to address things very directly. But I would say that that's one of the systemic things that is really key for Denver.
I couldn't agree more. I think that, look, when you talk about reporting, when you talk about prosecution, there's often, for us, there's this tendency to just go out in the community and train and talk and say we're going to do stuff, and please report to us. And if you aren't, I think, doing more to build community trust than just that, if you aren't showing people that you're putting your money where your mouth is, that this is that social justice, that racial justice are issues that you care about, then when they have the worst day of their life, or one of the worst days of their life, when they're a victim, they might not come to you. They might not trust you, right? There's another reason to do this broader work. I think it's just the right thing to do. But one of the issues that we've been focusing on is lead poisoning, which I think I mentioned earlier. In Rhode Island, across the Northeast and into the Rust Belt, there's this big issue of child lead poisoning still. You might have thought that had gone away 20 years ago, but as it turns out, it hasn't. In Rhode Island, about 500 kids are lead poisoned every year. The CDC just lowered the threshold for lead poisoning. We think that will probably increase the number to about 2,000 to 3,000. We're not a big state, so this is a very, very significant percentage of our child population that's being lead poisoned, and it leads to aggression and learning disabilities and criminal behavior. It's really, really bad. And it impacts our poorest communities, which tend to overlap with communities of color, immigrant communities. And so we saw this as a big problem, and so we wanted to do something about it to the best of our ability. We started civilly prosecuting landlords who, after being notified of lead hazards at properties where kids had been lead poisoned, still refused to remediate the lead, to fix the place up. And we've been very aggressive on those cases. And frankly, sadly, those cases are a lot more frequent than hate crimes in Rhode Island. When the hate crimes come up, we're going to aggressively prosecute them, no question. But I think I've filed something like 30 lead cases this year. And I do think that it is the right thing to do. It is social justice in action. But if you want to look at it from just like how to increase reporting and community trust, it isn't, I think, just about being out there and talking. I actually think that you have to do more, if you can, to bring about the sort of change you want to see.
Thanks so much. I'm going to shift gears yet again and talk about the legacy of hate. And I know Derek, Jumana, both your cities have taken an interesting approach to that. Would you mind sharing your experiences?
Sure. Want to go first?
It's all right.
I just spoke, but I can. One of the things, and I'll just use this as an example. Earlier this year, it was probably about I think it was June. Denver became the 5th city nationally, first city outside of the state of California to issue an apology to our Chinese community for a riot that actually took place in 1880 and destroyed our historic Chinatown and drove our Chinese community out of Denver. Even though it was 1880, I mean, the trauma, it was real, and it lingers, and it passes down through generations. And so amidst the anti-Asian hate that was going on too, and in my communications with some of our Chinese community members over my tenure, is that it became very apparent. I mean, they said, why, I would hear the comment, why would we trust the city government when they can't even acknowledge the history that of our city, you know, of our community in the city. And so when I went to the mayor and along with the chief of staff to ask, you know, can we do this apology, official apology, he said, absolutely, and without question. And so we had this big official apology that was issued. It was a community event. And I will tell you, it made national news too, you know, and for the city, and in talking to our Chinese community leaders, I mean, they said for the city to, one, acknowledge that it happened, two, to actually name it. It was a race riot, a white mob that came in and destroyed and lynched one of the business owners, to acknowledge the history, to name it, to acknowledge our city's role in allowing the hate to occur, and then turning our backs, city government turning its backs on the community, just to acknowledge our role, and then to apologize, and then to say, and next, this is what's going to happen, you know, as far as the historic markers, putting together a historic museum, to teach this in the schools and through various mechanisms. The response has been incredible, you know, as far as the acknowledgement and the healing that we are starting to see happen throughout the community. You know, just acknowledging that history. We've talked about, you know, the deniers of the Holocaust, and even with the internment camps, you know, that imprisoned my family. I mean, the twisted history that is being told with even that. I mean, I can understand the anger and the frustration and the lack of trust that happens, you know, when you don't acknowledge that type of legacy and that history.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I definitely want to build on that thread, because hate didn't just happen. We're not here because all of a sudden we have this uptick. I think we absolutely have to acknowledge the history of racism. We have to acknowledge that the undercurrents of what we are dealing with right now has always been there. And so certainly the historical aspect and the acknowledgement of that is very important. But it's also equally as important as how we repair it, how we respond to it. And so in the city of LA, as I shared at the onset, there is the creation of the Civil Human Rights and Equity Department. In 2019, the city signed in the Human Rights Law or Human Rights Ordinance, which essentially gave our department the authority to investigate discrimination complaints. And let's be clear, I mean, we talk about hate, but we're not talking about the continuum of hate. Mm-hmm. We heard yesterday in the session about sort of the seeds of hate that propel genocide, right? We have the Holocaust, we have, you know, the Rwandan genocide, the Armenian genocide. I mean, I can go on. Our history isn't pretty. But at the local level, we also have to know and understand that those same seeds of hate are what produces discrimination. And so our department has the authority to take on discrimination complaints in the private sector only in the city of LA. And that is as it pertains to education, employment, housing, and commerce. Now, We're a city, so we also have the state of California, who also, has a much bigger operational space in employment and housing. We do look at certain protected classes in those areas, but this work of this department in the ordinance and the human rights law and the discrimination enforcement came out because of advocacy. It was community-based organizations that advocated the city to create this department. So advocacy is very important, and I really want to put that out there. The other thing that's happening within our department, and even though we're a new department, but we're pretty extensive in the sense that not only are we looking to address discrimination, but we are also looking at how we invest in communities, right? Because that is critically important. So some of the things that our department is doing is looking at equity, looking at upward mobility, but we've effectively launched what's called Repair, and this was launched just recently. And Repair stands for Los Angeles Reforms for Equity and Public Acknowledgement of Institutional Racism. And what Repair is, it's a participatory budget model, which essentially launched in 9 zones or 9 areas that were identified by the city that have low-income communities. But it's through that process that those very communities have the ability to have a say in how $8.5 million will be distributed in these communities. So not only do we need to acknowledge, we need to also make the effort to ensure that those who have been left out of decision-making are at the center of decision-making. So it's not the hierarchy. The other thing that we have done, and we talked a little bit about trauma, and I know Faye, you also spoke about trauma as well, is we have launched what's called Peace and Healing Centers. Peace and Healing Centers will also be set up in 9 areas, and that RFP is out, and essentially faith-based organizations, community-based organizations can apply, where those Peace and Healing Centers, where we will have mental health and social services right there at the center in those very communities, housed by the very organizations that are serving these communities. So that's another example of how we invest and elevate communities. The other thing that we have within our department, and this is something that was launched by Mayor Eric Garcetti last year, and that is Reparation Commission. The Reparation is a blue ribbon commission, and it is working with our department to look at ways in which we can effectively implement reparation and provide advice and guidance to the city around reparation. So these are very tangible things, and I have to give a big shout out to my colleague David Price, who is leading this work with an incredible team. And so those are the tangible things that we at the local city level can implement, but I have to say we can't implement that in a vacuum, right? We have to work with our state colleagues, but quite frankly, the work is with grassroots organizations. It's because of their work, because of their advocacy, and because of what they do day in and day out, that will make a difference on the long run.
Thank you so much, Jamat and Derek. Those are really important examples and definitely leading the country when we're thinking about what we can do to address this legacy of hate. So we've talked about acute hate, systemic hate, the legacy of hate. This can be a little bit daunting for a state and local government. So a bit of a lightning round here, but in, let's say, 60 seconds or less again. Faye, Derek, and Keith, how do we get started? What do we do? What should other local governments do?
We began with a legislative change. We had some high-profile, violent, vicious, lethal killings in public spaces, racially motivated, and that really got people's attention. And so we had a lot of support for changes in the law. The law, the words on the page, our intimidation statute, led to further injustices because of the wording. It required 2 or more actors to be engaged in a criminal conduct in order for it to be charged as a felony. And if only one person was involved in that conduct, and that was a misdemeanor. And so we had a lot of support in wanting to correct this. We also we have a leader in our Attorney General, Erin Wilson, who undertook some listening sessions. She went around the state and she heard directly from the victims. What they told her helped to reveal a gap in the law. And then using that information, convened a task force which was comprised of a broad section of community members, leaders working in the criminal justice space, to review the law, make recommendations to improve the law. And those very recommendations you see in the statute, and it really did focus, take that shift away from the defendant and the actors and move it toward the victim. The victim is centered throughout the statute. It created a hotline. It created a new legal term called the bias incident. We're responding to bias incidents. Law enforcement now is required to make referrals to our hotlines when they respond to bias incidents. This was not happening. The majority of the reports to our hotline are bias incidents. People are being harmed, and they were told that the First Amendment issues, there's nothing we can do about it, and now they're required to make the referral. And the importance of that referral, it means that victims get help sooner. We don't have to wait for the end of a criminal investigation. We don't have to wait for a prosecutor's indictment. We can begin those culturally specific, trauma-informed services immediately. And the people we serve really appreciate that. On the hotline, we explain the criminal, we do crisis intervention, advocacy. We provide information about the criminal justice process, provide clarity about, so people can make choices about whether they want to report this to law enforcement or not. If they do so, we facilitate. We even go to court with them. We support them from beginning to end. And this is a unique service that we've been able to provide. We've had a lot of support. Initially, we only had one person doing this job, one person for the whole state. I was answering the phone line when it was first launched up, and I had to call in my background as a 911 dispatcher to get in there and to help folks. But we got a bias response coordinator, and for 2 years, it was just the two of us. We had an opportunity to ask the legislature for additional funding, and we told the stories. We talked about the work we were unable to do. We had a recommendation from our Criminal Justice Commission to increase capacity because 44% of our phone calls were going to voicemail. And knowing the demographic that we're working with, already marginalized, already impacted by inequity, we'd be breaching trust if we allowed those calls to continue to go to voicemail. So we jumped on the chance to ask for more funding. Right now, we have funding for 6 advocates, a couple of investigators, and a resource attorney. So we are able to do that region and statewide coverage in a way that is culturally specific, regionally specific. And we do outreach galore, and you're very, very right about getting out in the community. We show up at people's community events. We have online presence. We have, what is it called? I don't know, gear, just things with our label on it. And we also have a positive campaign called You Belong. Because we know it's part of the hate. It harms. We're here to help. And there has to be healing on the other end. We know how you treat trauma, how you treat victims of hate and bias, how you respond to them in the aftermath of hate and bias, can have a tremendous impact on their health and well-being and their ability to overcome this on the back end. And so we're very much committed to this kind of holistic approach. People exercise a great deal of courage in reporting to us in the first place, and we don't want to betray that trust. You can find us at standagainst.hate.oregon.gov.
Thanks, Kate.
So where to start is
Yeah.
okay. Community. It all starts with the community as far as the communication and hearing from them as far as what they see as the issue and how to address it. It always starts with the community. Secondly, leadership. I am so lucky that I work for a mayor. I've worked with this mayor for 30 years in different situations before he was even elected. But anything I've gone to him with, he has always been very supportive and said, yes, absolutely, we will do that. And being a leader, they're role models, and we've seen that if you lead in certain ways, people will follow, in both good and bad. But he has been willing to step out there and make strong statements as far as to move things along. So community and leadership.
Where to start? Well, I agree with everything Faye and Derek have just said. I think that listening to the community is absolutely true. That's where you have to start. But and it does depend on the role that you're in. But there's a lot that you can do that I think is like pretty at this point from the state and local level, like that it's like part of a playbook to some extent. You're gonna have to like have an avenue for reporting. I actually haven't talked about that. We have a reporting avenue in our office as well, both an online complaint form and a phone line. And then I think that it kind of goes back to community, but to local officials. I mean, in every state, your local officials are the ones who are closest to whatever is happening. And I think that maybe one of the issues with the hate crime response being like a little bit more federal is that it's just like harder for in Rhode Island, we have like a very small federal presence, small state, small US Attorney's Office. It's difficult for them to really reach out to the local officials, and they don't have trust, frankly, that the Attorney General does. We work with local officials all the time on different cases. So that can allow you, in an AG office anyway, to like step into, create those relationships with the local officials to basically like expand your impact, right? Like whatever it is that you want to do, whether it's a reporting or a prosecution initiative or something else, it really magnifies, frankly, the number of people that you have to work with you. But these are also people who are very closely connected to their communities, so it allows you to leverage those relationships. If you're in an AG office or you think that an AG office perspective could help you out, feel free to reach out to me after the panel today.
Thanks so much. Great advice. So we have essentially run out of time. So I'd ask all of you I think we are getting kicked off this stage in exactly 2.5 minutes. So perhaps we can take questions for the hall if there are any really that folks still want to ask those, but maybe we'll close out with a lightning round of anything in 30 seconds or less that you did not get a chance to share. And Jumana, we'll start with you and go down the line.
Yeah, I'll start by saying connectivity. This work doesn't happen in silo and on its own in our own little departments. It is connected to everything we do as local city government and everything we do and how we deliver services. So connectivity of all of this.
Thank you.
I'll speak really quickly about that deliverable. Here's the 30-second deliverable that our panel we all come at this from different angles. So we've come up with something that is, in some form could work great. Here's the basic idea. As a government official, when a hate crime or hate incident happens, to some extent what you're allowed to say is very limited. We've built out, I think, pretty successfully among this panel, government institutions and processes that work pretty well. But at the community organization level, there could be maybe more work that's done to work with us when an event occurs so that there can be a robust community response. So the idea is a community toolkit, something that community groups can use to direct people to right reporting mechanisms, to get people in touch with trauma-informed care, to kind of determine a path forward, whether they want to we're going to get kicked off. All sorts of great stuff. Community toolkit, that's the idea.
Thanks.
When I started this job 11 years ago, I had black hair. and now it's just so gray. And I'll be honest, when I first came here, I was tired. And I was, when the term is up next July 2023, I was going to say, I'm going to semi-retire and not do this type of stuff anymore. This conference has re-energized me. And I was telling folks yesterday that I still have something left. And it's come from you, all of the attendees here, where that energy has come from. So I just want to say thank you.
I want to say thank you. I want to remind folks of victims' resilience. To be able to report this, to move forward. The person I started with, he reached out to our hotline. We were able to help him. He was emotionally fragile. Years of racism had come and resurfaced. We were able to connect him to counseling. We were able to help him get through that and just remember the resilience of people who have endured this stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you, all of you. This has been a fascinating discussion, and every time I talk to you, I learn something more. I'm sure our viewers today and those here in the room have learned something from each and every one of you that they can take back with them. And just please join me in giving our panelists a round of applause. Thank you.